The dungeon was silent until the scratching began. In the shadows, a young prince sat chained, his breath shallow, his eyes wide with terror. He had been betrayed not by strangers, but by his own father, the king. And soon, the darkness around him would move. Hundreds of starving rats, set loose as executioners. This was no ordinary punishment. It was a spectacle of cruelty, a test of obedience, and a story so horrifying that history itself tried to forget it. But here, we uncover the truth. Why would a father condemn his own blood to be eaten alive? In the heart of a fading medieval empire, power was not only measured in armies and land, but in the fear that rulers could inspire within their own bloodlines. The tale of the prince devoured by rats begins not in the dungeon, where his cries would echo into silence, but in the golden halls of his father's court. There, beneath chandeliers dripping with wax and tapestries, woven with ancestral victories, a darker truth simmered beneath the surface, one of paranoia, treachery, and a father's obsession with absolute control. The king, revered as both warrior and tyrant, believed that loyalty was not inherited, it was forced. To him, even a son could become a rival, even a prince could become a traitor. And so, the seeds of cruelty were planted in corridors gilded with wealth, but haunted by suspicion. The young prince had been raised amidst this suffocating atmosphere, his every gesture weighed, his every word measured, as if his existence itself was a test he could never pass. Court whispers followed him like ghosts, saying he had the softness of his mother and not the iron of his father. That softness, the king believed, was weakness, a weakness that threatened the bloodline's authority. In a world where enemies circled the throne like wolves, mercy was a sin. Thus, the king began to view his son not as heir, but as danger. What unfolds in this story is not simply the tragedy of one boy's fate, but the anatomy of power twisted beyond recognition, where love was strangled by fear and a crown weighed heavier than human bonds. This was an age when execution was theater and cruelty was a message. The breaking wheel, the stake, the gallows, all were designed not only to destroy the body, but to remind subjects of the king's dominion over life itself. Yet none of these, in the king's eyes, carried the same grotesque poetry as the rats. Vermin, the carriers of plague and death, despised by peasants and priests alike, would become his tool of punishment. To be eaten alive by rats was more than death. It was degradation, a stripping away of humanity itself, reducing a prince to scraps of flesh gnawed in the darkness. It was the kind of death meant to erase not just a man but his memory. And so, as the court went about its banquets and tournaments, as nobles drank and jested under banners of honor, in the shadows a cruel plan was forged. The prince, accused of disobedience, some claimed it was forbidden love, others whispered treason, was led not to trial but to the underground chambers, where no sunlight ever touched. There, the scent of mold and decay thickened the air, and the silence was broken only by distant scratching. The king had made his choice, to make his son an example, a living warning carved into history with teeth and claws. The king's paranoia was not born in silence, but forged in the fires of constant rebellion and war. He had ascended the throne in an age when betrayal was as common as bread, when brothers murdered brothers for a crown, and neighbors conspired with foreign kings for a piece of gold. To rule meant to trust no one, not even your own kin. This belief hardened into law within the king's heart, and as years of rule weighed upon him, so too did the fear that his legacy would be stolen. A crown, after all, was not just a symbol of power, it was survival. And in his twisted logic, a son who loved too gently, who spoke too kindly, was a threat more dangerous than any army. For what use was a prince who could not strike fear? The prince bore this burden like an invisible chain. At court, his movements were watched, his friendships dissected, his very laughter treated as suspicion. Where other princes were taught the art of war, he was reminded of his weakness. The king, in drunken councils, sneered at his heir, saying the boy had inherited a poet's heart instead of a warrior's. It was a dangerous accusation in a kingdom where poetry was seen as softness and softness as betrayal. The court absorbed this venom, and soon whispers spread. Whispers that the prince was unfit, whispers that perhaps another claimant, more ruthless, more obedient, should inherit the throne. To the boy, the throne became not a destiny but a curse, and every banquet toast felt like a funeral bell tolling for his future. Yet, within the boy's heart flickered a light that no cruelty could entirely extinguish. He longed not for conquest or power, but for love and dignity. Some chronicles claim he had fallen for a woman of low birth, a union his father saw as disgraceful. Others insist his crime was refusing to partake in the brutal punishments the king demanded, showing mercy where cruelty was expected. Whatever the truth, it was enough to fracture the fragile bond between father and son. To a tyrant, any act of defiance, whether in war, in love, or in mercy, was treason. And so the boy's fate was sealed long before the dungeon doors closed. The king's decision was not taken in haste, but with deliberate cruelty. He desired not just the prince's death, but his humiliation. The execution of a common criminal was simple. The destruction of a royal heir required spectacle. To let his son fall beneath the sword would grant him the dignity of a warrior's death. To burn him alive would cast him as a martyr in the eyes of the people. But to cast him into darkness, to let vermin devour him. Rumors are the true assassins of royal courts, and in this kingdom, they slithered through stone walls like smoke from an unseen fire. At first, they were faint, suggestions that the prince was too gentle, too merciful, too unwilling to wield the sword with his father's fury. But as seasons turned and battles drained the kingdom's coffers, the whispers sharpened into daggers. Some said the prince had met with foreign envoys in secret, their cloaks concealing pacts of treachery. Others murmured that he had pledged himself to a forbidden love, a woman of common birth whose embrace threatened the purity of the bloodline. Whatever their origin, the rumors found fertile soil in a king's paranoia. To a ruler who trusted no shadow, even silence was proof of conspiracy. The court, like vultures circling a wounded beast, fed upon this uncertainty. Nobles with ambition stoked the fire, hoping to see the prince fall, so they might climb higher. Spies whispered into the king's ear, twisting innocent gestures into evidence of betrayal. A missed council meeting became a secret plot. A private letter became a coded message. A kind word to a servant became treason. And the king, desperate to preserve his throne, allowed himself to believe it all. History teaches us that a ruler's fear often becomes prophecy. What he most dreads, he conjures into being. And so, though the prince's heart may have been pure, the king saw in it only rebellion. The boy himself, unaware of the full weight of these accusations, lived as if a shadow were stalking him. Friends began to disappear from his side, either bribed or threatened into silence. Servants once loyal now avoided his gaze, fearful of being linked to him. Even in the great hall, he could feel eyes piercing him, stripping away his dignity with every hushed word. Isolation wrapped around him like a cloak, and in his solitude, despair began to take root. Still, he held onto fragments of hope. Perhaps his father would remember love. Perhaps mercy would prevail. But mercy, in this kingdom, was already a corpse. By the time the accusations reached their fever pitch, the trial was only a formality. No parchment of defense, no witness of truth could withstand the tide of fear and suspicion. The king's voice thundered above all others, declaring his son guilty of disobedience, betrayal, and dishonor. And though no blade was yet drawn, the boy's fate was sealed. In the chambers below the castle, where no sunlight dared intrude, his cell was prepared. Rats, starved and restless, scratched against their cages, waiting to become instruments of royal justice. The court moved on, banquets continued, but in the shadows, the most grotesque execution of the age awaited its victim. The descent into the dungeon was like a descent into the grave itself. Stone steps spiraled downward, slick with centuries of moisture, and each step seemed to echo like a funeral drum in the prince's ears. Torches sputtered against the damp walls, their flames choking in the heavy air, as guards dragged him by iron chains. The world of light, of banquets and gardens, of laughter and song, vanished behind him with every step. Down here, there was no crown, no court, no mercy, only darkness. The dungeon was more than a prison. It was a kingdom of shadows where the forgotten withered in silence, and the only throne was despair. The boy, who had once walked beneath golden banners, now stumbled in rags, his wrists raw from shackles, his eyes reflecting the flicker of torches like those of a hunted animal. The chamber prepared for him was not an ordinary cell. It was carved deep into the rock, a place chosen not merely to confine, but to annihilate hope. The walls were slick with mold, the floor cold and uneven, the stench of rot and filth suffocating. Iron bars sealed him in, but worse still was the scratching sound that never ceased, the sound of vermin scurrying in the shadows, waiting hungry. The rats had been starved for days, fed just enough to survive, but not enough to quiet their hunger. They were not merely pests here, they were weapons. Trained by cruelty, conditioned by starvation, they had been transformed into executioners. And as the prince sat on the damp stone, he realized that his death would not be quick, not merciful, but stretched out in agony, each bite tearing away his dignity piece by piece. Yet in those early hours of captivity, the boy clung to fragments of hope. He told himself this was a test, that perhaps his father was only trying to frighten him into obedience. He remembered stories of kings who had punished their heirs with brief imprisonment, a cruel lesson meant to harden their resolve. Perhaps, he thought, the dungeon would end with forgiveness. He imagined his father's voice softening, his chains removed, the horror forgotten. But as the scratching grew louder in the dark, that hope withered like a candle in the wind. He began to understand that there would be no lesson, no forgiveness, only death. The guards who passed by his cell offered no words, only stares, some cold, others pitying. Their silence was its own verdict. Outside, the world continued, the court feasted, the kingdom went on with its daily rituals. But down here, time twisted into something cruel. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days. The prince tried to pray, his lips trembling with half-remembered verses, but even prayer felt hollow in a place where God's light could not reach. The scratching grew closer, bolder, until he could see the red gleam of eyes in the shadows, watching, waiting. And in that moment he understood the true genius of his father's cruelty. This was not just execution, it was terror made eternal. He would not simply die. He would wait for death, hear it crawling toward him, feel it bite into his skin, gnawing away his body and his sanity. This was not punishment, it was obliteration. While the prince sat in chains, the world above the dungeon remained deafeningly alive. The great hall resounded with laughter, goblets of wine clinked against one another, and the smell of roasted meat drifted through the corridors. Courtiers, their silken sleeves dragging across polished tables, spoke of politics, hunts, and marriages, as if a royal air were not rotting beneath their feet. It was the most chilling contradiction of power, that life, wealth, and celebration could continue unbroken while a son of the crown was condemned to wait for death in darkness. The court was not blind to his suffering, but it was complicit. For in every monarchy, silence was survival. To speak against the king was to court ruin, and so tongues wagged about everything except the boy's fate. In the orchestra of power, the prince's suffering was the unspoken note, heard by all but acknowledged by none. The nobles, dressed in velvets and jewels, treated the boy's imprisonment as though it were an inconvenient rumor, a shadow better ignored. Some told themselves he deserved his fate, that mercy was weakness, that a ruler could not afford sentiment. Others, perhaps, felt pangs of guilt but drowned them in wine and song, choosing comfort over conscience. And yet, beneath the surface of their merriment, fear kept them obedient. They knew the king's wrath was unpredictable, his suspicion unending. If he could do this to his own son, what mercy would he show them? Thus the banquets went on, a grotesque mask covering the festering rot of tyranny. Meanwhile, in the dungeon below, the prince could faintly hear the echoes of this revelry. At times, the laughter of courtiers seemed to seep through the stones, mocking him. The faint smell of feasts wafted down in fragments, cruel reminders of a world he could no longer touch. Hunger gnawed at his belly as rats crept nearer, drawn by the scent of sweat and fear. Every sound became torture. The scurrying of claws, the distant murmur of voices above, the clang of a guard's boots across the stones. It was as if the world above and the world below existed in two dimensions, one drenched in excess, the other drowning in despair, both joined by cruelty. The king, too, sat among these banquets, raising toasts to victories, his crown gleaming in the candlelight. His silence about his son's fate was his greatest weapon. He never explained his decision, never justified his cruelty. To the court, it was a mystery left deliberately unsolved. By not speaking of it, he transformed his son's suffering into legend. Whispers grew sharper. If the king could condemn his own heir to the rats, what would he do to us? That question was the true executioner, spreading fear through every noble heart more effectively than any sword. The boy's agony in the dungeon was not just punishment for him. It was theater for the kingdom. And above all, it was a performance meant to immortalize the king's dominion, written not in ink but in blood, fear, and silence. Yet even in a court where silence was survival, whispers refused to die. Servants carried fragments of truth from the dungeons. The boy's cries in the night, the stench of his unwashed body, the sound of chains dragging across stone. These servants moved like shadows, sweeping the floors and pouring wine, but their ears collected secrets, and secrets, once born, demanded to be spoken. In the kitchens, as bread baked in great ovens, hushed voices asked, "How long can a prince endure such torment?" In the stables, as grooms brushed the manes of horses, they muttered, "What kind of father condemns his blood to rot among vermin?" These whispers rose like smoke, invisible but suffocating. The king never acknowledged them, but he knew. He always knew. His paranoia sharpened with every rumor, until he trusted no one, not even those who bowed deepest before him. The common folk, too, began to learn of the prince's fate. Farmers who brought grain to the castle spoke of strange rumors, that the heir lived in chains, that he was dying slowly, eaten alive by hunger and rats. These tales spread from market stalls to taverns, growing more twisted with each retelling. Some said the prince had gone mad and sang to the vermin as if they were his companions. Others claimed his spirit had left his body and that only a shell remained in the dungeon. To peasants, the story became legend even before it ended, and legends, once loosed, cannot be chained. The king understood this danger well. Power is never threatened most by swords, but by stories. A blade can kill a man, but a story can kill a dynasty. Thus, he doubled the guards around the dungeon, forbidding any outsider from approaching. Those caught speaking of the prince's imprisonment too loudly were silenced with brutal efficiency, sometimes vanishing, sometimes found floating in the river with stones tied to their legs. Fear spread thicker than plague. Yet still, the whispers persisted, for whispers are like roots beneath the soil, unseen, unstoppable, breaking stone over time. What made these whispers powerful was not only their cruelty, but their poetry. Mothers told their children, "Do not anger your father, or you will end up like the prince beneath the rats." Street performers, careful never to name the king, wove tales of a boy imprisoned in the dark, so that laughter in the marketplace carried the echo of tragedy. It was through such tales that the boy, still chained in misery, became immortal long before his death. The king, seeking to destroy his son's legacy, had only carved it deeper into the kingdom's memory. Beneath the weight of the fortress walls, where sunlight never reached, the dungeon existed as a world apart. It was not merely a prison. It was a grave dug into the earth while the body still lived. The air there was thick with damp rot, dripping from moss-covered stones. Chains clinked faintly whenever the boy stirred, a sound that echoed endlessly in the chamber as though mocking his movements. Rats scurried freely, their small claws scratching over stone, their red eyes gleaming in the dark like scattered embers. To them, This boy was no prince, no heir, but only flesh, weak, bound, and edible. The cruelty of his imprisonment lay not in pain alone, but in the silence. Above his head, the court feasted, musicians played, and nobles plotted. Yet here, no human voice reached him. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, until time itself dissolved. The boy marked the passing of hours by the hunger pangs in his stomach and the patterns of gnawing on his body. The rats came first at night, emboldened by the stillness. They tested his skin, nipped at his toes, then retreated. Later they returned bolder, their numbers greater, until the boy understood he was not their prisoner, but their prey. The torches that guards carried into the chamber burned for only moments before leaving him again in complete blackness. It was in this darkness that the mind begins to unravel. He spoke aloud at first, calling for his father, then his mother, then for God. But when no reply came, not even an echo, for the dungeon devoured all sound, he began speaking to the rats themselves. Sometimes he begged them, offering scraps of food he could not eat. Sometimes he cursed them, screaming until his voice bled raw. And sometimes, worst of all, he laughed with them, the sound cracking, desperate, no longer belonging to a boy, but to something unmoored from sanity. The king believed such a death would erase his son's memory, that a boy eaten alive by vermin would inspire no loyalty, no rebellion. But fate has its own taste for irony. The silence of that dungeon did not erase the boy's voice. It amplified it. Every servant who imagined his screams carried those cries into the world above. Every peasant who whispered the tale gave him new life. Even as his body wasted, his legend grew. While the boy rotted in silence below, life in the royal court continued with lavish indifference. The banquet halls were alive with golden goblets clinking, roasted meat steaming, and laughter echoing against painted ceilings. Courtiers feigned ignorance, but whispers spread like wildfire in secret corners. Everyone knew the fate of the prince, yet no one dared speak openly. To mention his name was to challenge the king's will, and that was a death sentence in itself. Yet in hushed tones behind velvet curtains, his suffering became a story, grotesque, forbidden, but unforgettable. The ladies of the court whispered of his beauty now with horror, imagining his once delicate skin gnawed raw by vermin. Some believed it was only a rumor, an invention by enemies of the crown to blacken the king's image. Others swore they had heard his muffled screams through the stones during midnight hours, when the feasting ended and the palace fell silent. Guards who carried torches down to deliver scraps to the dungeon returned pale, trembling, unwilling to describe what they had seen. The smell alone, a fetid stench of decay mixed with fear, was enough to convince many that the story was true. Yet even as nobles shivered, they could not resist repeating it. A prince eaten alive by rats, on his own father's orders, was too shocking, too unnatural, to keep contained. The story carried into the taverns of the city, where drunkards retold it with embellishments. Some said the king had cursed his son at birth, others that the queen's ghost wailed outside the dungeon each night. The tale traveled further still, crossing borders with merchants and envoys, twisting into different versions, but always circling back to the same unshakable horror, a father condemning his son to be devoured alive. In this way, the dungeon became both tomb and theater. Each unseen bite of a rat echoed in the imaginations of those above, every day fueling the legend. The king's attempt to erase his son's claim to glory backfired. Instead, the prince was reborn in whispers, his suffering transformed into myth, his death into prophecy. Even before his last breath, he had become immortal, not through crown or sword, but through terror and memory. Deep within the bowels of the fortress, the young prince endured a torment that stretched far beyond physical pain. The stone walls of his cell wept with dampness, and the flickering torchlight from passing guards barely pierced the endless night that surrounded him. His body, once regal and admired, was reduced to a frail shell. Rats crept in from the cracks and shadows, their claws scratching against stone, their eyes glinting like tiny, merciless stars. They no longer feared him. They claimed him piece by piece, gnawing his flesh, feasting on his weakness. He tried to fight them, tried to crush them with what strength remained, but hunger had hollowed him out, and despair drained the last reserves of will. The days blurred together in agony. His screams began strong, echoing up through the dungeon's passages, sharp enough to wake even the most hardened soldier. But over time, those cries became hoarse, then whispers, then whimpers barely audible over the rats' chittering. Some guards who passed his cell swore they could hear him praying, desperate, fevered words to a God who seemed deaf to his suffering. Others claimed he no longer prayed, but cursed, not just the rats, not just the Father who condemned him, but the very heavens that allowed such cruelty to unfold. His mind fractured beneath the torment. Shadows began to move on their own. Whispers that weren't his own filled the silence. Sometimes he saw his mother's face in the dark, her eyes filled with sorrow, her lips mouthing words he could not hear. At other times, he swore the rats spoke in human voices, taunting him with the laughter of courtiers, the commands of his father, the hollow condolences of priests. Reality and nightmare blurred until he could no longer tell which world he occupied. And yet, amid the horror, there was defiance. Even as the rats devoured him, he would not give his father the victory of complete submission. Some nights he forced himself upright, pressing his broken body against the cold wall, whispering into the void, "I am still a prince." His words may have been lost to the stones, but within him they burned, a final ember of pride refusing to die. That ember made his torment all the more haunting, for in trying to erase his son, the king had instead created a symbol, one of suffering so monstrous it could never be forgotten. Above the dungeon, the world of the court carried on, gilded and perfumed, its halls echoing with music and laughter. Courtiers feasted on roasted meats and sweet wines, blissfully ignorant, or perhaps willfully blind, to the horror festering in the stone beneath their feet. Yet whispers began to spread like wildfire. Servants exchanged knowing glances. Guards carried rumors out of the fortress into taverns and marketplaces. The story of a prince condemned to be eaten alive by rats was too grotesque, too monstrous to remain confined to the shadows. It clung to people's tongues, feeding on their curiosity and fear, spreading from ear to ear until the entire kingdom hummed with unease. Merchants carried tales along trade routes, dressing the story with details so vivid it became legend overnight. Some said the prince had already been devoured, that nothing but bones and shredded robes remained. Others claimed he had survived, that his cries still echoed nightly beneath the fortress, haunting the king's sleep. Each retelling made the tale darker, more fantastical, until the truth, however cruel, was swallowed by myth. For the common folk, it was not simply the death of a prince they discussed. It was the corruption of a king, a monarch who would rather feed his own son to vermin than forgive an act of disobedience. This whisper of tyranny took root like a poison. Peasants muttered that such a king could never be blessed by God. Priests in hushed tones wondered if the realm itself was cursed. Mothers pulled their children closer when soldiers passed, fearful that such cruelty could spill outward into the villages and fields. Even among the nobility, cracks of doubt began to show. The grandeur feasts felt hollow. The weight of gold rings on their fingers felt colder. For if the king could destroy his own blood, what mercy could anyone else expect? And yet, the king remained steadfast. When rumors reached him, he silenced them with threats and punishments, executing those who dared to speak too boldly. But the whispers did not die. They grew stronger, feeding on secrecy, carried in the shadows where his soldiers could not reach. For every silenced voice, 3 more rose in defiance. The horror of the prince's fate became more than a tale. It became a symbol of the hidden rot within the kingdom's heart. And in that rot, seeds of rebellion began to stir. The king did not see himself as a monster. In his own mind, he was not a father who had condemned his child to torment, but a sovereign who had chosen duty over weakness. The crown was not a toy, nor was it an heirloom to be passed lightly from one generation to the next. To rule was to wield fear, to mold loyalty through terror, and to keep rebellion crushed beneath an iron heel. To him, his son was no different from any other traitor, a reckless youth who had threatened the sanctity of the throne with disobedience and love for a woman unworthy of royal blood. By condemning him, the king believed he had preserved order, sealed cracks in the fortress of power, and sent a lesson carved into the flesh of a prince that no noble, no commoner, no knight could ever ignore. Yet within the solitude of his chambers, as torchlight flickered against tapestries embroidered with the victories of his lineage, unease gnawed at him. Shadows whispered questions he dared not answer. Was it truly justice, or was it cruelty? Was it strength, or was it cowardice dressed in royal robes? The king's nights were restless. Though his body lay upon silken sheets, his mind remained trapped in the damp stone dungeon where his son wasted away. Each cry that rose from beneath his fortress seemed to slither upward through the stones and coil around his dreams. At times he imagined the sound of scratching, claws against rock, vermin feasting, echoing in the silence of the night. He rose often from his bed, pacing before the window of his chamber, looking out at the moonlit courtyard where guards marched in silence. His reflection in the glass no longer resembled the man who had once been hailed as a warrior king, the defender of borders and slayer of enemies. Instead, he saw a figure burdened by shadows, a man who ruled not with honor, but with fear. And though he silenced courtiers who dared to whisper about the prince's fate, he could not silence the whispers in his own skull. Still, he doubled down on his resolve in the light of day. Before his council, he declared himself a protector of the realm's order. He claimed that even a prince, even a beloved child of the throne, was not above the law of obedience. "The kingdom is my firstborn," he told them, "and any who betray it are already dead to me." His voice carried steel. His eyes dared no man to challenge him. The courtiers bowed low, masking their horror behind false smiles. They knew that to question him was to risk the same fate that had befallen the prince. Yet their silence was not loyalty. It was survival. The queen, silent and pale as marble, never spoke of her son. Her tears were shed in secret. Her prayers whispered behind closed doors. She had begged the king in the beginning, falling at his feet, reminding him of the boy's laughter, his first steps, the way his small hand had once clutched his father's own with devotion. But the king had pushed her away. Now she lived like a ghost within her own palace, haunted by a grief she dared not voice. Even her ladies in waiting avoided her gaze, for they knew that her sorrow was a dangerous mirror of the king's sin. The king's justification spread through the court like a cold wind. Some parroted his reasoning, insisting that the prince had defied the natural order of succession, that his punishment was an example of divine justice. Others whispered of tyranny, of a man who had traded his humanity for the illusion of power. And outside the walls, in taverns and market stalls, the common people judged him not by the words of his counsel, but by the image of a father destroying his son. Justice, they murmured, could never crawl from the belly of rats. But the king clung to his belief, wrapping himself in the armor of duty. To falter, to regret, would be to unravel, and he could not allow weakness to stain his legacy. Yet no matter how he spoke of order and strength, no matter how he punished dissent, the specter of his son's cries lingered. In the end, the king's justification was not a shield but a chain, binding him ever closer to the dungeon he pretended to forget. In the damp belly of the fortress, where the air smelled of mold and rusted iron, the prince had fallen into a silence so profound it terrified his jailers. Once his cries had been constant. His voice had echoed through the dungeon like a hymn of suffering, hoarse, broken, raw with despair. They had grown used to it, those terrible sounds that rattled the chains of their own souls, reminding them that the prisoner was not merely a body wasting away, but a man enduring torment too great for words. But as the weeks passed and the rats grew fat, his voice began to fade. The guards would press their ears to the door of his cell and hear nothing but the faint scurrying of vermin, the soft drip of water, and their own uneasy breath. That silence weighed heavier than screams ever could. The prince had not died. No, his body still clung to life, frail though it had become. His once proud shoulders were hunched now, his back curved like the bough of a broken branch. His face, which had once carried the glow of youth, was pale and hollow. But his eyes, those eyes had not lost their fire. When the door creaked open for the rare delivery of stale bread and foul water, the guards dared not meet his gaze. For in those eyes there was no plea, no beg for mercy, no hint of surrender. Instead, there was an abyss of judgment, as if he had become the executioner of their souls rather than the condemned. He had discovered something in that dungeon, something his father had not foreseen. Suffering had stripped away his pride, his royal arrogance, his sense of invincibility. But in the naked emptiness of pain, he had found clarity. He began to understand that death would not be his defeat, nor would survival mark his victory. The true measure of triumph lay in refusing to allow cruelty to consume his spirit. His silence was his weapon, sharper than any blade, more haunting than any scream. By refusing to grant his tormentors the satisfaction of sound, he turned their cruelty inward, forcing them to confront the abyss of their own actions. The rats continued their feasting, and still he remained silent. Their teeth tore at his skin, their bodies scuttled across his chest, yet he clenched his jaw and endured. He closed his eyes and remembered her face, the woman he had loved, the reason he was here, her smile, her laughter, the warmth of her hands. He remembered stolen walks in the garden at dusk, moments when the world outside the palace walls seemed simple, pure, untouched by crowns or decrees. In those memories, he built a sanctuary that no rat could enter, no stone could trap. He told himself that if his love had been enough to defy a kingdom, then it was enough to shield his soul from corruption. And so the prince waited in silence, day after day, night after night. His body weakened, but his spirit refused to bow. The guards grew restless, their hands trembling as they set down his water jug. One whispered to another that the silence was worse than the screams, that it followed him home, into his dreams, echoing in the cradle where his infant child slept. Another swore he had seen the prince's eyes glowing faintly in the dark, as if lit by some unholy fire. None dared speak of these things to the king, for they knew that the king despised weakness, and yet, in their secret hearts, they began to wonder if the prince's silence was not a defeat, but a curse that would spread to them all. Even the rats seemed to sense it. They swarmed, yes, but there were moments when they hesitated, when they gathered in the corners of the cell and watched him with twitching noses, as though confused by his refusal to respond. The prince stared back at them without flinching, a pale figure surrounded by darkness, transformed into something almost otherworldly. In silence, he had become more than a man. He had become a symbol of defiance, a reminder that even the most brutal chains cannot bind the will of a soul that refuses to break. The dungeon was no longer the king's triumph. It was his shame, festering in the bowels of his castle, growing heavier with each silent hour. What had been meant to be a spectacle of terror had become a silent judgment, echoing louder than cries ever could. The prince's silence condemned not only his father, but every man and woman who had allowed such cruelty to stand. It was the silence of a martyr, the silence of a son who had chosen dignity over survival. And though no one yet dared to say it aloud, that silence was more dangerous than rebellion itself. Above the dungeon, the court was beginning to tremble. At first, the silence of the prince seemed a victory to the king. No rebellion had arisen, no subjects had dared to raise their voices, and the young man rotted in the dark like an insect crushed beneath a boot. But cruelty has a strange way of echoing, and silence has a way of traveling farther than screams. Whispers began to thread their way through the stone halls of the palace. Servants exchanged glances when they passed one another, their tongues heavy with words they dared not speak aloud. Courtiers smiled in the presence of the king, but behind their gilded masks they murmured in secret, "The boy does not scream anymore." This whisper carried a weight the king could not control. To some, it was a sign of madness, that the prince had broken beyond repair. But to others, it was something far more dangerous, a sign of endurance, of a spirit untouched by torture. The nobility who once dismissed him as a foolish romantic began to reconsider. For if a man could endure the rats, the filth, the unending cruelty of the dungeon without bending, what did that say about his will? And if such a will existed, what might it ignite in the hearts of others? At banquets, goblets clinked and laughter rang, but beneath the sound of harps and lutes, hushed conversations grew bolder. They spoke of how the prince's silence was not the end of his story, but the beginning of something greater. Rumors grew that his silence was deliberate, a vow he had made to defy his father. Some swore that they had seen his face in their dreams, pale and luminous, speaking to them without words, urging them to remember what it meant to be human. A nobleman, too drunk to bite his tongue, whispered that the king's greatest punishment had turned into his greatest mistake. For silence, unlike screams, cannot be contained. The priests, too, began to stir. At first, they had remained loyal to the throne, preaching obedience and submission. But they were men of faith, and faith bends differently under the weight of cruelty. One old priest muttered that the silence of the prince resembled the silence of saints who endured martyrdom in ages past. Another dared to suggest that perhaps God himself had given the boy strength. And so the silence began to bleed from the dungeon into the churches, whispered in sermons, passed in prayer, spreading through the veins of the kingdom like fire beneath ash. Even the queen, bound by duty and fear, could not escape its grip. She had once stood beside the king, her crown heavy but her heart steady. Yet in the long nights, when she sat alone in her chambers, she heard the silence of her son echoing within her. She had not visited him. The king had forbidden it. But mothers do not need to see their children to know their suffering. She pressed her rosary beads until her fingers bled, whispering prayers not for his survival, but for his spirit. She knew that the boy she bore was already lost to her embrace, yet his silence had become her shield against despair. The king noticed, though he did not speak of it. His wine tasted sour. His throne felt colder. He barked louder orders, demanded harsher punishments, but his fury no longer drew the same fear. Men obeyed, yes, but with hesitation. The silence of the dungeon had seeped into their bones, softening the edges of obedience. It haunted their dreams and lingered in their prayers. The king had caged a body, but he had unleashed an idea. And an idea, once freed, cannot be chained. The fortress itself seemed to breathe with it. The guards who patrolled the walls whispered of footsteps where none had walked, of voices carried on the night air. Some swore that when they stood near the dungeon's door, they felt as if someone were watching them, not the prince, but something greater, something invisible and vast. It was as though the silence had summoned a presence that pressed against the stone, waiting, watching. Fear of rebellion had not yet struck the kingdom, but fear of something stranger, something holy or unholy, had begun to take root. In taverns, peasants spoke of the prince as if he were already a martyr. They carved crude images of him on wooden cups, passed them hand to hand, whispering blessings. Some believed he was still alive, others that he had already died, and that the silence was his spirit haunting the king. In both cases, the silence became legend. Stories spread faster than truth, and in their spreading, they gained power. The dungeon was meant to erase the prince, but instead, it had carved him into memory. The king's advisers grew restless. Some urged him to end it, to kill the boy outright and be done with it. But others warned that execution would make him a martyr in truth, sealing his story in fire and blood. The king, caught between pride and fear, chose neither. He waited, and in waiting, he allowed the silence to grow until it consumed everything. His court still bowed, his people still paid tribute, but the whispers no longer feared him. They feared the silence more. The boy had been condemned to rot, but instead, he had become eternal. In the darkness of the dungeon, with no crown, no sword, no voice, only silence, he had accomplished what no army could. He had broken the kingdom without ever leaving his cell. For man who had built his life on control, the first cracks of doubt are the deepest. The king had ruled with iron certainty, believing that fear was stronger than love, obedience stronger than compassion. His philosophy was simple. Men bent when broken, and those who did not bend were discarded like chaff in the wind. Yet now, As the silence of his son stretched unbroken through days, weeks, months, he began to feel the earth beneath his throne shift. In the dead of night, when the torches flickered low and the palace stood hushed, he found himself pacing. His chamber, lined with tapestries depicting kings of old, suddenly seemed to mock him. They stood frozen in eternal glory, their faces proud and serene, while he, the living king, was restless, gnawed by unease. He would pause before their eyes, gripping the hilt of his sword, and wonder if they judged him for losing control of what should have been a simple punishment. The silence haunted him. It was not a silence of absence, but a silence that felt present. When he closed his eyes, he heard it, a stillness that rang louder than any scream. He tried to dismiss it as his imagination, but the more he dismissed, the louder it grew. He had once been certain that he had broken his son. Now, he began to wonder if it was the other way around. The queen's coldness did not help. She fulfilled her duties at his side, but her eyes no longer lingered on him with devotion. She spoke less, prayed more, and when she did look at him, it was with a gaze that carried quiet accusation. He caught her once pressing her lips to a small carved wooden cross, her hands trembling. The sight filled him not with jealousy but with dread, for he knew she prayed not for him, but against him. The council grew bold. They cloaked their defiance in careful words, but he could hear the edge beneath them. "Your Majesty," one had dared to say. Perhaps mercy now would show greater strength than cruelty. He dismissed the man with a glare, but the words echoed in his mind long after. Mercy. To him, mercy was weakness. Yet, he could not deny that his iron fist had begun to rust. Sleep abandoned him. Dreams came, and they were not kind. He saw his son, pale and gaunt, standing at the foot of his bed, saying nothing, only staring. Sometimes, in the dream, rats swarmed over the boy, but instead of screaming, he smiled. Other nights, he dreamed of the throne room filled with people, all silent, their eyes fixed on him with unyielding judgment. He would wake with a start, gasping for air, the sheets soaked in sweat. Superstition began to creep into his heart. He was not a man of faith. He had mocked priests in his youth, relying instead on steel and strategy. But now, in the long hours of darkness, he wondered if some unseen hand guided this silence. Had he cursed himself by tormenting his own blood? Was the boy's endurance not human, but something divine, or worse, something damned? He summoned priests to bless the palace, though he did not admit the reason. He ordered more wine, more women, more distractions, but the silence seeped through them all. Meanwhile, the city around him began to change. Markets hummed with stories of the silent prince. Mothers told their children tales of his endurance, warning them to be strong as he was strong. Soldiers, who once laughed at the thought of him, now muttered prayers in his name before battle. Even criminals whispered of him in the shadows, claiming the silence gave them courage to resist the lash. The king could feel it. The very walls of his kingdom were whispering against him. And yet, pride is a cruel chain. He could not release the boy, for that would admit defeat. He could not kill him, for that would forge a martyr. So he lingered in torment, choosing the one path that would destroy him most, waiting. Each day he descended into paranoia. He questioned his guards endlessly, demanding to know if the boy had spoken, if he had cried, if he had begged. The answers were always the same: nothing. No sound, no plea, only silence. One guard, trembling, admitted that he had seen the boy's eyes in the dark, bright, alive, watching him like a predator from its cage. The king struck the man across the face, but when he was alone, the words clawed at his thoughts. The silence had turned from a punishment into a crown. The king, though crowned with gold, felt stripped of power. The boy, though rotting in filth, now ruled hearts. It was a reversal so profound, so unnatural, that the king could not bear to speak of it. And so he hardened his cruelty further, believing that more pressure might shatter what had refused to break. But in truth, it was not his son who stood on the edge of collapse. It was him. His legacy, once secure, now stood in question. Would he be remembered as a ruler of strength, or as the man who created a legend by accident? In the deepest recess of his heart, though he never admitted it aloud, the king began to fear not the boy's silence, but the judgment of history. For kings die, crowns tarnish, empires fall, but stories live forever. And his son's story, forged in silence, was already slipping from his grasp. In a palace that echoed with silence, the queen became its quiet heart. She had not spoken publicly against her husband, for she knew such defiance would only tighten his cruelty. Yet in private, she lived in prayer. Each night, when the king slept or drowned himself in wine, she crept to the chapel, a small, stone room hidden deep within the palace walls. Its candles flickered weakly, their smoke clinging to the damp air, but to her it was a sanctuary. She knelt for hours, the cold floor biting into her knees, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles whitened. She prayed not for herself, nor even for her husband, but for her son. She prayed that his spirit remain unbroken, that his suffering be transformed into something greater than torment. Sometimes her voice cracked with sobs, but often she prayed in silence, believing that God heard what words could not carry. The queen remembered the boy not as a prisoner, but as her child. She recalled the softness of his hair when he was an infant, the way his tiny hand once clutched her finger with fierce trust. She remembered his laughter, quick and light, like sunlight spilling through the windows of the old nursery. To think of that joy now buried beneath filth and chains tore her heart into pieces, yet it also strengthened her resolve, for she knew what the king had forgotten. The spirit touched by love could withstand even the greatest cruelty. Her ladies-in-waiting noticed a change in her. They found her pale, weary, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights, but when she lifted her gaze, it burned with quiet fire. Some whispered that she had gone mad. Others whispered that she was becoming a saint. To the queen, such words mattered little. What mattered was that she did not allow despair to swallow her. To give up hope would be to betray her son's endurance. The chapel soon became more than her refuge. Servants began to follow her, kneeling beside her in secret. First, a maid who had once cared for the prince's clothes. Then a guard, ashamed of having locked the boy's chains. Then others, cooks, scribes, even lowly stable hands. They came at night, risking the king's wrath, to join her in whispered prayer. None dared speak too loudly, but the sound of their murmured voices grew like the hum of bees in a hidden hive. It was not long before rumors spread that miracles were tied to her prayers. A soldier who had been wounded returned healed after asking her blessing. A woman barren, for years, conceived after touching her hand. Whether these stories were true or born from desperation did not matter. What mattered was that people believed. The queen, cloaked in sorrow, became a living symbol of endurance. Her son's silence was his weapon, and her prayer became hers. Even the priests of the city took notice. At first they hesitated, fearing the king's wrath, but faith cannot be silenced when people cling to it like breath itself. They began to mention the boy in sermons, not by name, but in parables, a lamb that would not cry out, a dove that would not flee, a light that no darkness could smother. To the king, these were harmless metaphors. To the people, they were truth disguised as allegory. The queen herself began to sense that her prayers reached beyond the stone chapel walls. In her dreams, she saw her son standing, though gaunt and pale, his eyes burning with strength. In some dreams he was surrounded by chains that melted like wax. In others, he stood above a great crowd, silent yet commanding their devotion. She would wake weeping, her hands trembling, but not with despair, with awe. Her faith became defiance. Quiet, hidden, but unyielding. Where the king tried to break his son with isolation, she wove a web of devotion that reached every corner of the palace, then spread to the streets, then to the fields beyond. And though she never said it aloud, she believed something her husband never could, that silence was not the absence of power, but its beginning. It was perhaps her greatest act of rebellion to believe, for in a kingdom built on fear, faith itself was revolution. If the queen's prayers were the kingdom's hidden heartbeat, the king's fury was its thunder. He had begun to sense the whispers, the way people turned their heads in the marketplace when his guards passed, the silence that followed his footsteps in the great hall. Though no one dared speak openly, he knew what stirred beneath: pity for his son, reverence for the boy's silence, loyalty that slipped through his fingers like water. And nothing stoked his rage more than knowing he could not control it. The king stormed through the palace like a storm in human form. His cloak whipped behind him as he walked, his fists clenched, his voice echoing in curses against shadows. He had executed men for far less than this, yet the silence of one child had made him vulnerable in a way no army ever had. His counselors advised patience, urging him to ignore the whispers. But patience was a virtue he had never possessed. To him, mercy was weakness, and weakness was death. In his chambers, he raged against his wife. He accused her of treachery, of poisoning the people's minds with her tears. He threw goblets against the wall, their silver denting and wine bleeding into the stone. The queen stood quietly, her face pale but unyielding, refusing to give him the satisfaction of fear. The sight only deepened his madness, for silence seemed to haunt him at every corner, in his son's cell, in his wife's defiance, in the people's murmurs. Silence had become louder than his rule, so he turned his wrath back on the boy. Each week, he descended into the cell, his steps heavy with fury. He ordered harsher conditions: the straw bedding removed, the chains tightened until they cut into the boy's skin, food reduced to crumbs and stagnant water. Still, the child remained silent. At times, the king screamed directly into his son's face, veins bulging in his temples, spittle flying with each word. But the boy's lips did not move. His eyes, hollow yet steady, became a mirror to his father's weakness. The king struck him then, again and again, with the back of his hand, with his fists, with a whip when rage burned too hot. But the silence held. The boy did not cry, did not plead, did not beg for life or mercy. It was as though every blow landed not on flesh, but on the king's own pride. And pride was the one wound he could never allow to bleed. Tormented, the king began to plot crueler punishments. He threatened to blind the boy, to brand his skin with iron, to break his bones one by one. Yet each time, something restrained him, perhaps the unspoken fear that such cruelty would make the child a martyr. Perhaps the strange unease that lingered when he looked into those quiet eyes, eyes that seemed to see something beyond him, beyond the throne itself. The king, for all his power, felt small in those moments, as though his son's silence was not weakness but judgment. And so his rage turned outward. He lashed at his people, imposing heavier taxes, ordering executions for those who dared whisper the prince's name in taverns or marketplaces. He sought to stamp out faith with terror, but terror only hardened devotion. For every peasant punished, 2 more prayed in secret. For every guard he hanged in suspicion, 3 more swore allegiance to the silent boy in their hearts. The king's kingdom was rotting from within, and the stench of his desperation filled the air like smoke before a fire. The queen, though silent herself, saw the unraveling clearly. She knew her husband was no longer fighting for a throne. He was fighting against his own fear. And fear, once it takes root, devours even the strongest kings. The more the king sought to crush the silence, the more it spread like a shadow over the land. In taverns, men leaned close across ale-stained tables, lowering their voices as they spoke of the boy who would not break. Mothers told their children, in hushed tones before bed, of the prince who endured chains without a cry. Farmers in the fields passed the tale along rows of wheat, as though planting faith in the soil itself. The silence that once belonged to one boy now belonged to an entire people. The story carried with it a strange power. It was not the firebrand cry of a rebel general, nor the eloquent speech of a philosopher. It was a quiet resistance, harder to trace, harder to kill. For what army could march against a whisper? What gallows could silence a thought? Even among the king's soldiers, men who had sworn oaths of blood, the tale found its way. Some hardened themselves against it, while others, in the solitude of night, prayed for the boy whose chains were heavier than their swords. Merchants traveling from town to town carried news like smuggled goods. They spoke of a kingdom weary of the lash, weary of taxes, weary of the blood that watered the streets each time the king's anger flared. "The people bow by day," one said in secret, "but at night they kneel to the prince." Another claimed that in villages by the river, children now played a dangerous game called the Silent King, where one child sat in mock chains while the others tried to make him speak. None succeeded, and the game ended only when laughter turned to tears. The whispers reached even the clergy. Priests who had once blessed the king's name now hesitated. They could not erase from their minds the image of a boy enduring in silence while cruelty thundered above him. In sermons, some slipped subtle words of defiance, cloaking prayers for the child within hymns. The king's spies reported it all, but his punishments, no matter how harsh, only deepened the quiet faith burning in secret hearts. What unsettled the king most was not the open defiance. He could crush that with sword and fire. It was the sense that the people no longer feared him. Fear had been his throne, his crown, his true army. But when fear gives way to faith, no tyrant's hand can reach deep enough to reclaim it. And so rebellion began not with a battle, but with a whisper, carried in the wind, passed from lips to lips, until the very air of the kingdom seemed charged with it. The boy in the dungeon did not know of this rising tide. He did not hear the whispers or see the prayers lit in candlelight. Yet in his stillness, he had become the silent leader of a nation that had begun to dream of freedom. His silence, once a prison, was now a weapon. And though the king still ruled from his throne of iron, the kingdom was already slipping from his grasp, not with a sword's clash, but with the whispers that haunted the kingdom seeped like smoke into the very chambers of the king. He sat upon his iron throne, surrounded by wealth and power, yet felt no peace. His crown weighed heavier than ever, not from gold, but from suspicion. Every council meeting, every feast, every petition brought to him seemed tainted with betrayal. When a servant poured his wine too slowly, the king wondered if poison lingered in the chalice. When his generals exchanged glances, he imagined conspiracies woven in silence. The boy's defiance had planted a seed of madness in his heart, and it grew like a thorned vine that pierced deeper with each passing day. The more he tried to smother the tale, the more it seemed to escape him. His soldiers were ordered to scour taverns, to break up gatherings, to whip anyone who dared whisper of the boy. Yet, as blood was spilled in the streets, the silence only deepened, more haunting than screams. In punishing his people, the king only confirmed what they had long begun to suspect, that he feared a chained boy more than armies at his gates. The palace itself became a prison of suspicion. He accused his advisers of treachery, banished some, executed others, until the great hall echoed with emptiness. His queen, once a confidant, withdrew from him, frightened by the storm that had consumed her husband's eyes. At night, when the torches burned low, the king would wander the halls, sleepless, listening for whispers that were never there. In his madness, he believed the stones themselves conspired, the wind carried plots, and shadows hid traitors, waiting for his fall. In secret, he descended to the dungeon more often, staring at the boy who sat chained in silence. He raged, he threatened, he promised rewards beyond imagining if only the boy would speak. Yet the child's stillness mirrored his own corruption back at him. Each moment of silence was a dagger, cutting deeper than any word. "Why will you not cry?" the king once demanded, his voice breaking not in fury, but in desperation. The boy only lowered his gaze, his silence heavier than a mountain. Paranoia transformed the throne into a cage. The king, who once ruled with iron certainty, now found himself ruled by a fear he could not conquer. He had slain men by the hundreds, burned villages to ash, yet he trembled at the memory of a boy's silence echoing in every chamber of his mind. What he did not see, what he could not bear to see, was that he himself had become the prisoner, chained not by iron, but by dread. The kingdom outside felt the shift. Though the king's decrees grew harsher, they no longer carried the same terror. His punishments were not seen as strength, but as weakness, the lashing out of a man who no longer trusted his own throne. And so, in hidden corners of the realm, rebellion began to move from whispers to plans. Farmers sharpened their tools not for harvest, but for war. Merchants hoarded grain for sieges yet to come. Soldiers, weary of fighting their own people, began to wonder whether their loyalty was worth the shadow of a king who feared a child. In his chamber, the king clutched his crown at night, staring into polished metal as if it might whisper back the loyalty he once commanded. But the silence remained, the same silence that filled the dungeon, the same silence that haunted his dreams, the same silence that foretold his fall. For the more he fought it, the louder it grew, until silence was all that remained of his power. The boy had spoken no words, yet his silence became a force more powerful than the king's armies. Day after day, the dungeon swallowed him in darkness, but beyond its walls, his stillness grew into legend. In taverns where men once spoke of war and harvests, they now whispered of the boy who would not break. Mothers told their children of him as though he were a saint, a martyr of flesh still living among them. Songs were sung quietly in fields, their melodies carrying like prayers across the valleys. The boy's silence was no longer absence, it was presence, a fire hidden beneath ashes, waiting to ignite. The king, consumed by fear, could not see what his cruelty had birthed. By chaining a child, he had given the people something greater than gold, greater than bread, a symbol of defiance that belonged to them all. Even those who had once bowed to the throne now found themselves standing taller when they remembered the boy's name. His silence was their voice, their unspoken fury against the crown that oppressed them. The dungeon had not buried him. It had raised him higher, placing him beyond the king's reach. Meanwhile, the boy himself remained unbroken. Though his body weakened, his eyes never lost their quiet fire. Guards who once mocked him began to look away, ashamed by the calm strength in his gaze. Some even softened, slipping him scraps of food, whispers of news from outside, and promises that the people were waiting. They told him of farmers refusing to pay their taxes, of soldiers deserting in the night, of banners sewn in secret that bore not the king's crest, but a simple mark, the symbol of chains broken in silence. The silence spread like a contagion. In markets, merchants would fall quiet when royal officials passed, their muteness more cutting than curses. In temples, priests preached sermons laced with parables of a lamb defying the lion. In barracks, soldiers began to train slower, their loyalty fractured by doubt. Silence became a weapon, sharper than steel, heavier than stone, uniting peasants and nobles alike in defiance. The king, blinded by paranoia, mistook this silence as submission. He believed his terror had finally worked, that the people were too broken to resist. Yet in truth, every moment of quiet was the sound of rebellion building, the hush before thunder, the stillness before the storm. The boy's silence had given them something the king could never steal: hope. And hope, once born, cannot be chained. The king's court had grown restless, but none dared to speak their full truth aloud. Ministers shuffled parchment, generals argued over maps, and priests muttered prayers, yet all of them knew the same thing. The people's silence was no longer fear, but defiance. Still, the king remained blind. He mistook the quiet taverns, the hushed markets, and the subdued voices as signs of obedience, not realizing that each silence was a blade drawn against him. He was a man who had ruled too long by terror, and terror had made him deaf to the sound of change. Every report brought before him was laced with warnings. Tax collectors returned empty-handed, villages refused to kneel, and soldiers deserted into the night. But the king's pride, heavy as iron, would not allow him to accept the truth. He slammed his fist against the throne's armrest, declaring that the boy was broken, that silence meant surrender, and that the crown would always stand unchallenged. Yet his words rang hollow even in his own hall. Ministers bowed their heads, not from loyalty, but from the knowledge that the crown was cracking. Beyond the walls of the castle, the boy had become something no sword could kill, an idea. Stories of him traveled farther than any royal decree, spreading across borders into lands where other rulers listened and trembled. The boy's silence was no longer a single act. It was a language, spoken by thousands who refused to speak. And in that refusal, they had found power. The king, blind to all this, ordered harsher punishments. He demanded heavier taxes, public executions, and iron shackles for those who resisted. But the more he tightened his grip, the more the silence grew, swallowing his kingdom like a shadow at dusk. Even his guards no longer looked him in the eye. Even his priests prayed with less conviction. Even his family dined in silence, unable to pretend that the crown was unshaken. He sat alone on his gilded throne, surrounded by gold, banners, and the hollow echoes of power. Yet for the first time in his reign, he felt small. His castle loomed high above the land, but its foundations trembled. He had believed himself eternal, untouchable, chosen by fate. But fate was cruel, and the boy's silence was louder than any king's command. The blindness of the crown had doomed him, and he did not yet know it. Fear had been the mortar that held the kingdom's walls together. For decades, every whisper, every trembling hand, and every bowed head had built the illusion that the king's rule was eternal. But mortar cracks when the weight above it grows too heavy, and in this kingdom, fear had become too brittle to hold. The people no longer trembled when the guards marched past their homes. They no longer silenced their children when royal decrees were read in the village square. Instead, they looked at each other with steady eyes, as though silently reminding themselves that they had already endured the worst and survived. The boy's tale had spread in ways the king could not imagine. At first, it was carried by traders who slipped through the kingdom's borders, whispering to foreign markets of the cruel punishment imposed by a father on his son. Then traveling minstrels wove it into their songs, strumming lutes beneath tavern rafters, turning suffering into melody. Soon priests in faraway chapels delivered sermons about innocence betrayed, comparing the boy's silence to a saintly act of martyrdom. Even in neighboring courts, nobles leaned close and asked, "What kind of ruler orders his own child to be eaten alive by rats?" The king had meant to destroy a boy, but instead, he had created a symbol that undermined his throne, and so the kingdom's silence transformed. Where once silence had meant obedience, it now carried rebellion. Villages stopped sending grain to the crown, claiming drought or blight, though their fields ripened under the sun. Blacksmiths forged weapons in secret instead of plowshares. Market stalls filled with rumors more than goods, each rumor a dagger sharper than steel. The king's soldiers began to hesitate, for they, too, had mothers and children in those villages, and the sight of their families refusing to bow unsettled their loyalty. The king tried to crush this invisible revolt with blood. He ordered mass arrests, public hangings, the burning of homes. Yet even as the fires rose, the silence deepened. Those who died on the scaffold did not beg or scream. They faced death with mouths closed and eyes unblinking, as if to remind their executioners that silence was now the people's weapon. The executioner's axe no longer silenced rebellion. It carved it into memory. Fear, once the king's sharpest blade, had dulled. He was no longer the executioner of his people's will, but the prisoner of his own. And as silence replaced fear in the hearts of men and women, the kingdom began to slip beyond his grasp, like sand falling through clenched fists. The final stage of torment had begun. The dungeon that had once echoed with prayers and muffled cries was now a chamber of madness. The prince, once a figure of noble grace, had become unrecognizable, gaunt, hollow-eyed, his body marked by wounds too gruesome to count. Yet the worst was not behind him, for the king's torturers, determined to drag every breath of horror from him, unleashed the true executioners, a horde of starving rats, bred in filth, conditioned for savagery. The moment the cages were opened, the creatures poured forth like a living tide of hunger. Their red eyes gleamed in the torchlight, their yellow teeth clicking against the stone as they swarmed over the boy. He screamed, a sound so piercing it cut through the very walls, but no one came. The court above listened in silence, for this was the spectacle decreed by the king. The prince thrashed, chains rattling violently as rats tore into his flesh. His hands shook uncontrollably. His voice broke into pleas that dissolved into sobs. "Father, father," he cried, but the throne remained unmoved. The king sat cold and expressionless, allowing his son's agony to serve as a warning to all who might betray him. Each bite, each scratch, each whimper was a thread woven into a tapestry of cruelty. What had begun as a father's punishment had now become a feast of monsters, a scene where humanity itself seemed to rot away. The prince's voice cracked under the weight of his suffering, his throat torn raw from endless cries. The rats no longer feared his thrashing. They clung to him as if he were nothing but carrion left to rot in the wild. Their teeth sank deeper, gnawing through his skin, burrowing into the softer flesh beneath. The dungeon smelled of iron and rot, a suffocating mix of blood and decay. Torchlight painted grotesque shadows on the walls, shadows that writhed and twisted as though the stone itself bore witness to his torment. His body, once strong and graceful, trembled uncontrollably. Every nerve screamed as if aflame. Every bone rattled with desperation. He tried to shake them off, but the chains bound him too tightly, dragging him back into helplessness each time he lunged. In those moments, his suffering passed beyond the realm of flesh. It was as though his very soul was being chewed away, bit by bit, until nothing remained but agony. Above, in the great hall, the king's advisers dared not speak. The silence of the court was deafening. The king's face betrayed no sorrow, no remorse, only the steely resolve of a ruler who had chosen cruelty as his crown. For him, this was not only punishment but a declaration. Mercy had no place in his reign. The cries of the prince, echoing like the lament of a dying bird, reverberated through the stone corridors, seeping into the ears of every servant, guard, and noble who lingered nearby. And yet no one dared intervene, for they knew that to cross the king was to invite the same fate. The prince's spirit began to break. His eyes, once fiery with the vitality of youth, glazed over with despair. His lips quivered as he whispered words only the dungeon walls could hear. They were not curses, nor pleas, but fragments of memory, his mother's voice, the laughter of his youth, the warmth of sunlight on castle gardens. Those fragile images flickered in his mind, desperately clinging to him as the last refuge against the darkness consuming him. Yet even these were eroded by the rats, their gnawing turning his memories into screams. Hours dragged by, though to him each moment stretched into eternity. The tormentors did not end it swiftly. They fed the spectacle with deliberate slowness. Whenever the rats threatened to tire, scraps of meat were waved before them, driving them back to their feast. His chest heaved violently as fever spread through his wounds. Sweat mixed with blood, dripping to the floor in steady, mocking rhythm. He realized then that his father would not relent, not until every shred of dignity was torn from him. Death, once feared, now seemed a mercy he longed for. But mercy was the one gift denied to him, and so the prince lingered in a twilight between life and death, his body still breathing, but his soul already slipping into shadow. The rats ruled his world now, their shrieks and squeals rising above his whimpers. In that grotesque harmony of man and beast, the dungeon became a theater of despair, and he, its unwilling star. The dungeon was no longer a place, but a living nightmare, a pit where time dissolved and suffering reigned. Hours bled into hours, though for the prince there might as well have been centuries. His body was nothing more than a battlefield of wounds, raw, gaping flesh gnawed by the relentless teeth of vermin. The chains groaned as he convulsed, yet they held firm, dragging him back into place each time he tried to thrash against his torment. His breaths came shallow, ragged, each one tasting of rust and decay. Fever raged through his veins, setting his skin aflame from within, while cold sweat clung to him like a second shroud. The rats had grown bold now. No longer satisfied with mere scraps of skin, they pushed deeper, burrowing into muscle and sinew. Their whiskers twitched as they vanished into the cavities they had carved, emerging again with crimson snouts glistening in the flicker of torchlight. The prince's cries had softened into broken sobs, the sound of a spirit stretched to the brink of madness. At times, his voice cracked into a pitiful laugh, a hollow sound that chilled even the guard station nearby. They averted their eyes, but still they listened, for the dungeon carried no mercy for the ears. His mind teetered on the edge of delirium. Images surged in chaotic waves. His mother's soft hand brushing his hair, the vibrant banners of festivals, the golden glow of spring fields. Yet, as quickly as they came, the rats returned him to reality, dragging him back into pain with each bite. He whispered her name, over and over, like a prayer lost to stone. His tears mixed with blood, rolling down his face until they dripped onto the filthy floor. He longed for her embrace, for the tenderness that could never again be his. The boy who had once dreamed of knighthood and honor was reduced to little more than a trembling child in the dark. Above, the castle slumbered. Noble feasts ended, wine cups clattered, and laughter echoed faintly in the halls. Yet beneath those stone floors, the heir to the kingdom lay crumbling in silence, his scream swallowed by the cruelty of walls designed to muffle and contain. The king knew this. He had ordered it so. Each cry muffled, each plea ignored, served as a symbol of his dominion. He wanted no weakness in his line, no rebellion of heart. For him, the son's death was not tragedy but necessity, a cold reminder to his people of what loyalty and obedience demanded. But for the prince, time now moved strangely. He no longer felt the passage of moments, but only the rhythm of pain. His vision blurred. Torch flames danced like phantoms before his eyes. His ears rang with the cacophony of squeals, each one echoing like laughter at his misery. He tried to recite prayers, yet his words tangled, collapsing into incoherent murmurs. The rats scurried, their claws scraping bone, their bodies pressing into him as if the dungeon had become their banquet hall. The stench was unbearable. The foul mix of sweat, blood, and gnawed flesh thickened the air until even his lungs seemed to choke on it. A moment came when he lifted his head, straining against the weight of the chains. His hollow eyes gazed upward toward the cracks in the stone ceiling, where faint shafts of light seeped in. For an instant, he imagined that the heavens themselves had opened to grant him deliverance. He mouthed a final plea, not for rescue, not even for forgiveness, but for an end. His body, trembling and broken, no longer clung to life. It begged for release. Yet the cruelty of his fate denied him still. Death lingered near, like a cruel spectator unwilling to grant him the curtain's fall. As dawn approached, the rats slowed, their hunger momentarily sated. They retreated into shadows, bellies swollen, leaving behind the trembling ruin of what had once been a prince. His chest rose weakly, each breath a fragile thread binding him to the world. His voice, scarcely more than a whisper, escaped in fragments of memory. The warmth of sunlight, the sweetness of summer fruit, the laughter of companions now gone. His eyes fluttered closed, then snapped open again, unwilling to surrender but incapable of enduring. In that twilight between life and death, he no longer belonged to the world of men. He was caught in the abyss, a soul wandering the narrow edge where agony becomes eternity. And though his father's throne sat firm above, though the kingdom remained blind in its slumber, the dungeon knew the truth. Here lay the slow unraveling of a dynasty, carved not by blade or fire, but by the gnashing teeth of vermin and the unrelenting cruelty of a king's will. At last, the prince's body slumped, trembling with exhaustion, each breath a shallow whisper of life. The rats, their frenzy spent, had retreated into the shadows, leaving him exposed and broken on the cold stone floor. The dungeon that had been his prison, his tormentor, and now his witness, was eerily silent. Not a sound remained save the faint drip of water from the ceiling and the slow, labored rhythm of a boy's final breaths. His eyes, once bright with innocence and curiosity, now reflected only the shadowed torchlight and the vast emptiness that had consumed him. In that quiet, the weight of his suffering became absolute, a silence more profound than any scream, more final than any strike of the executioner's blade. Above, the king remained seated on his throne, oblivious to the true cost of his cruelty. He had won, so he thought. The boy had not defied him in life. Yet as the hours passed, even he began to sense the tremor in the kingdom. Guards whispered in corners, ministers exchanged fearful glances, and even the people's silence seemed to carry a weight heavier than any sword. The king's triumph felt hollow, for the legacy of his son's suffering was already echoing through every hall, every village, every heart. Fear had been replaced by a reverent, haunted silence, and the boy's death would fuel that silence for generations to come. The dungeon's darkness now held more than shadows. It held the echo of courage, the whisper of endurance, and the unbroken spirit of a child who had endured the unimaginable. His silence, which the king had sought to destroy, had become immortal. Every villager who had heard of him, every minstrel who had sung of him, every priest who had whispered his name, carried a fragment of that defiance into the world. The boy's life had ended, yes, but his story, carved from pain, resilience, and unwavering dignity, would never be forgotten. In the kingdom, the fear that had once ruled like iron began to erode. The throne remained, but the people's loyalty wavered, fragile and questioning. Whispers of rebellion, of justice, of the boy who had suffered on the orders of his own father, grew louder in hidden corners. The king, in his cold pride, could not yet see that his power had been hollowed out from the inside. The memory of the prince's silence, the ultimate act of endurance in the face of cruelty, had become the seed of his undoing, and so the dungeon held its final silence. Not a sound, not a cry, not a whisper, just the stillness of a world forever changed. The boy, the prince, the silent martyr, had passed from flesh, but his essence lingered like a shadow on every wall, in every hearth, and in every heart that knew the story of what had been endured and what had been lost. His death was not meaningless. It was the ultimate testament that even in the face of unimaginable horror, silence could speak louder than tyranny, and that courage, once sown, could not be buried by cruelty. The kingdom would remember, the world would remember, and the name of the boy who was eaten alive by rats, on the orders of the father who feared him, would echo forever as a story of silent defiance, a dark testament to the extremes of cruelty and the unyielding power of human endurance.